There are many extreme religious practices and rituals out there, but there may be none more extreme than the Buddhist monk practice of Shokusenbutsu. This brutal ritual was created in 835 AD, and since then, over 1,000 years, countless monks have tried to do it. However, only 24 have ever actually been successful. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 3 phases of this ritual, and at the end, I'm going to show you pictures of what a successful Shokusenbutsu looks like. However, be warned, the images are very disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is counting something really important, start shouting out random numbers to mess them up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live, and there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Shokushinbutsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Last week, our company decided that we needed to hire a graphic designer, and so I got tasked with finding candidates. Now, I got no idea how to do that, and so naturally, I went on Google and I looked up, where can I find good graphic designer candidates? But I accidentally wrote malnourished, angry saltwater crocodiles instead of good graphic designer candidates, an easy mistake to make. But because I didn't catch it, before long, me and old Seagull Lung were stuck up in northern Australia up to our lacrimal puncta in Crocodilus porosus. Now, of course, me and Lung did our best to try to calm these beasts down and try to teach them graphic design to make the most of this work trip. But these salties were just not that interested in graphic design, and they lacked basic finger dexterity. And so, it was as we were sitting up in this tree, hiding from this bask of angry salties down below, that old Lung jumped up and threw a javelin directly into my heart and said, "Apa miertnem hesnalod ZipRecruiter," which of course in Hungarian means, "Dad, why didn't you just use ZipRecruiter?" And boy was old Lungy right. ZipRecruiter uses its powerful technology to both find and match the right candidates to your job. ZipRecruiter also has a user-friendly dashboard with a full suite of tools that will allow you to filter, review, and rate your applicants all in one place. And now, with the invite to apply feature, it lets you immediately access a list of candidates with qualifications that match your job description. See a candidate who'd be perfect for your job? ZipRecruiter makes it easy to send a personal invite to them and other top choices. See how much easier hiring is with ZipRecruiter, which is the #1 rated hiring site according to G2 satisfaction ratings as of January 1st, 2022. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And now you can try ZipRecruiter for free by going to ziprecruiter.com/MrBallen. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/MrBallen. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Okay, back to the story. Sokushinbutsu was created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Sokushinbutsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it, and maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it, and then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana through this process. The instructions for Sokushinbutsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree-eating training, and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees, things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit. But because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1,000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1 2 or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called Nyojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushinbutsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box, so there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground, and then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves 2 purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete phase 1, you certainly can't complete phase 2 or phase 3. So it's like a filter. It weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree-eating diet, combined with the constant physical exercise, removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle, and so they're incredibly lean by the end of phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves 2 purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of phase 3. Speaking of which, so in phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo shoot is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them, they ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death is to remove yourself from the vicious human life cycle of birth, suffering, death, repeat. Meaning, becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushinbutsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body, it removes their fat and muscle, it also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body, and their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushin Butsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushin Butsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still might practice it in secret. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is counting something really important, start shouting out random numbers to mess them up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered versions of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, to join our Discord server, to see what events are coming up or what announcements are coming out of our studio, go to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is going to be physically uncomfortable to listen to. And at the end of the story, I'm going to show you a video that is highly distressing. So viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please encourage the like button to join the official MrBallen Discord server, but secretly manipulate their account so that no matter how engaged they are on the server, they can't level up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of three named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes' drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot-long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called Berth Number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use Berth Number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of Berth Number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else. Okay, so imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket, and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically that's what this habitat was. Perea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed. And so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on. He dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface. He talked to the folks on the boat. They handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat. And then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. This is not a normal ad. I am not trying to get you to buy anything. Instead, I want you, all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious, to join our Discord server. It's completely free. Really, totally free. And if you don't know what Discord is, don't worry. I learned about it like 2 months ago. It's a totally free to download app that allows communities to get together in one centralized place, and ours is awesome. Once you click on the Discord invite link in the description below, you'll be brought through a very simple onboarding process, and then boom, you're in. And if you have any issues along the way getting set up, we have incredible moderators and people in the community that are ready to help you. And then once you're all set up, just start participating. There's so much to do in there. There's all these different forums and voice chats. There's live digital campfire storytelling that members are self-organizing. I'm seriously on there all the time, happy to chat with you. And the more you engage with the server, the faster you level up. You come in at level 1 with certain privileges, and the top level is level 100, and along the way, each level offers real-life rewards that are specifically tailored to fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious, and I can promise you some of the upper-level rewards are pretty good. Also, we will be using Discord as the place we go to drop announcements, whatever it is, whether it's a new event or a new product or anything to do with our universe, we're going to Discord first. And we have a lot of huge things planned over the next couple of years, and so it really benefits you to be in the know. And again, all you gotta do is join the server. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, click the Discord invite link below in the description, or click on any of the Discord invite links in my social media bios and join up, and then start participating and work your way towards level 100. But don't wait, because literally thousands of people are doing this, and we will always be able to tell who signed up early. It literally gets attached to your username, and we will likely begin rewarding people that joined the server early. So again, click the Discord invite link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe, and it also began sucking in seawater. Basically everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath, and so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200-foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking, they're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys who were very badly battered at this point. I mean, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head. He felt scuba tanks, 2 of them, and he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They'd get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further. But Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well, like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Perea Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You got to go back down. You got to save them. But Ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface, but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe, because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Perea Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe. And so to finish this story, I'm going to show you the final footage taken by one of the divers, Kazim, who was the one who got the wrench and brought it back inside the habitat, handed it off, and then that wrench was used to push the lever, which created the vacuum. You'll see in this video that it looks like nothing is going on, and Kazim is just inside of this habitat, and all the divers are fine, and then it's like his camera just turns black. What's happening there is he was pulled. Today's story inspired a popular horror movie, and when you get to the reveal in this story, you'll understand why. It is literal nightmare fuel. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and toast all of their bread and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One day in early January of 1987, a very strange 52-year-old woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy walked out of her 11th floor apartment in Chicago, Illinois. Today was the day that Ruthie was going to be doing one of her self-appointed public duties. Ruthie was quite tall, and this particular day, she had on 2 pairs of pants with a dress over them. She also had her favorite long stick she was carrying. And as Ruthie marched down the hallway, she began jiggling each of her neighbors' doorknobs to see if they were unlocked. And then in between each doorknob check, she would suddenly stop and wave her stick around like it was a sword, and she was fighting off some unseen attacker. And so after Ruthie had checked 4 doors in a row that were all locked, she reached the 5th door, and when she tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. And so without any hesitation, Ruthie pushed the door open, she stepped inside and began yelling, "Hey, look at me, I'm inside of your apartment!" And the woman who lived in this 5th apartment was in her kitchen making dinner at the time, and when she looked up and saw Ruthie barging into her apartment, she wasn't scared. She was just totally annoyed. She rolled her eyes and then began yelling at Ruthie to get out now. But as always, Ruthie didn't listen. And before long, Ruthie had moved from the doorframe into the apartment, into the kitchen, where she was waving her stick around wildly and berating this young woman for leaving her front door unlocked in this very dangerous apartment building. The young woman yelled at Ruthie a few more times to try to get her to just leave, but Ruthie didn't budge, and so eventually this young woman picked up the phone and called 911. It would turn out the 15-story apartment building that Ruthie and this young woman and all of their neighbors lived in was indeed a very dangerous place to leave your front door unlocked. In fact, at the time, in the late 1980s, this particular apartment building was considered to be one of the most dangerous places in all of Chicago, with a murder occurring there nearly every week. Gangs basically ruled the building, which was totally falling apart and totally decrepit and had these long, dark hallways that thieves and killers could hide in. And so Ruthie wasn't wrong in trying to get her neighbors to keep their doors locked, but her very hands-on approach to delivering this message was never met with appreciation from the people who lived on her floor. Instead, her neighbors viewed Ruthie as potentially more hazardous than anything Ruthie was trying to protect them from. However, in reality, Ruthie was not a threat to her neighbors. She was just totally mentally unstable and basically afraid of everything. For example, whenever Ruthie got mail, she would just assume that it was terrible news and most likely about someone coming to take all of her money. And when Ruthie was out in public, which was quite rare, she was so scared of strangers that whenever she passed them, she would just yell out obscenities at them to keep them away. And then also, when Ruthie was in public, she never ate because she was afraid strangers were going to literally run up and take her food. So, back inside of this 5th apartment that Ruthie has barged into, Ruthie was busy berating this young woman about her unlocked door when the police did finally show up and they dragged Ruthie out of the apartment into the hall. The police, by this point, knew Ruthie really, really well, and they were not about to arrest her. They knew she was harmless, but just kind of out of her mind. And so, like they always did in this situation, they told Ruthie to leave her neighbors alone and just go back into your apartment and mind your own business. And Ruthie usually would mutter something under her breath about needing to increase the security in this building, but she would eventually do as she was told and she would go back home. And that was basically Ruthie's life in a nutshell. Constant fear and paranoia from living in this totally dangerous apartment building, exacerbated tenfold by her very poor mental health. But Ruthie was not content with her life. She, like virtually everybody else in this high-rise apartment building, wanted to get out and live somewhere else and have a better life. But Ruthie, like virtually everybody else living in this high-rise apartment building, did not have enough money, and so she was trapped there. But then, in February of 1987, so 1 month after busting into that woman's apartment, Ruthie got incredible news. She had recently begun going to a day program for psychiatric care at a local hospital, and the staff there had really taken a liking to her, and they were going above and beyond trying to help Ruthie kind of get her life together beyond just her mental health. And so one of the things they were doing with her was helping her apply for various government programs like disability payments. And so that month, in February, Ruthie found out that the application they had sent off for her was approved, and so Ruthie was entitled to disability payments, which meant right away she would get a check for $2,000, and then every month going forward indefinitely she would get a payment. It wouldn't be $2,000, but it would be a lot of money. Ruthie was beside herself. She could not believe her luck. And she now knew that with this money, she would finally be able to move out of that terrible apartment. Even before the money began coming into Ruthie, she was already looking for a new place to live. And as she did this, all she could think about were her 2 beloved grandchildren, a little boy and a little girl. They were the only people in the world, it seemed, to Ruthie that really accepted her and just loved her unconditionally. And so whenever Ruthie would go visit her grandkids, the 3 of them would sit on the ground and just play together for hours and hours. But to that point, Ruthie's grandkids had not been allowed to visit Ruthie at her apartment because it was too dangerous. But now that Ruthie was going to move into someplace much, much safer, she knew that was going to change. She was going to see her grandkids so much more often. And this made Ruthie so happy. And this newfound happiness inside of Ruthie really motivated her to start looking at other aspects of her life and see if she could improve them. And so, as Ruthie is doing this new apartment search, she began taking classes to finally get her high school degree. She began picking up these old art projects she had kind of blown off. And also, most importantly to this story, she really began leaning into her religion, something she had not been doing for a long time. Specifically, she began tuning in to these very animated preachers that she would find on TV. And when she really liked one of them, she would write them a letter, and in this letter, she would praise them for their sermons and how incredible they were. And she would ask them to bless her with miracles. And these miracles were often just centered on her health. She wanted to look and feel young again. And some of these TV preachers, who were actually just running scams, would write back to Ruthie and say, "Of course we can bless you with your miracles, but first, send us some money." And so, when Ruthie's disability payments began coming in, even though she needed to save every penny to be able to afford moving out to start this beautiful new life with her grandkids, she still found a way to set aside some of that money and sent it off to these TV preachers. And soon, these preachers were sending things back to Ruthie. Things like a blessed piece of wood for her to sleep on, or bottles of water said to be from the holy river Jordan. These spiritual items were often accompanied with a letter from these preachers telling Ruthie that in order for them to fulfill her miracles request, she would need to keep these spiritual items close to her and also send us some more money. And so Ruthie did as she was told, and after sending off all this money, she would excitedly wait inside of her apartment for her miracles to come true. And while she waited, she began tacking up all these newspaper articles all over her apartment of these people who miracles had happened to them, that supposedly God had fixed their teeth or eradicated a tumor in their brain or cured them of cancer. And in all of these stories, the person who the miracle happened to would describe looking in the mirror one day and just looking different. And that was the moment they knew that this miracle had occurred. And so Ruthie, believing this was bound to happen to her any day because she was working with these TV preachers, began going to her bathroom mirror all the time and just looking at herself, looking for some visible change in her appearance that would indicate one of her miracles had come true. But by April 22nd, so roughly a month after finding out she was going to be receiving these payments, and this was about 2 weeks before she was set to actually move out into her new place, Ruthie had still not seen any sign in the mirror that she had changed, and so she believed these miracles had not happened yet. But something else had begun happening when Ruthie was in the bathroom looking at herself in the mirror. And that was, she would hear somewhere off in the distance the sound of someone talking to her. It was almost like they were whispering to her, but she couldn't quite tell what they were saying. Now, Ruthie wanted to believe that these disembodied voices had something to do with her miracles coming to fruition, but Ruthie was naturally a very paranoid and scared person, and so she couldn't help but be a little bit scared of these voices. And so that afternoon, when Ruthie was on the bus headed back home after a doctor's appointment, she told a friend on the bus about these strange whispers she was hearing, and Ruthie would also say that she felt like these whispers meant that somebody was out to get her. Now, Ruthie's friend knew Ruthie really well, and this just wasn't unusual behavior for Ruthie. Ruthie routinely thought people were out to get her, and she talked about hearing voices before in the past. And so this friend told Ruthie that, you really should tell someone about this. But deep down, this friend was not that concerned. This was kind of normal Ruthie behavior, and this couldn't be a big deal. However, it would turn out to be a huge deal. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. As many of you may have already heard, our beloved swearatawalrus.com is now officially off the internet. There was no better way to let off steam after a long, hard day than to sit down and see a stupid old walleye face staring back at you on a Zoom call and just letting the obscenities fly. But don't worry, me and old Lung found an alternative stress reliever that's just as good. The website is beatupaleprechaun.com, and as the name implies, it allows you to finally lay the smackdown on those crafty little monsters. All you gotta do is log into their website, go to their leprechaun radar screen, and the second you see one of those little weasels pop up nearby, it's time to suck down some fight milk and go to work. Old Lung and I quickly became addicted to this service, taking down 1, 2, 10, 50, 1,000 ornery leppies in a given week. But last night, we ran into a serious issue. We tried to log into the website, but as we did, we got hit with a pua! Bah, 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 bah. And as we're laid on the ground, struggling to survive this pua onslaught, the leppies outside heard us struggling to survive, and they took advantage. They came inside, and they laid the smackdown on us. And then after the dust settled, old Lungy rolled over in pain, and he croaked out, "Papa, devi iscriverti a NordVPN," which of course in Italian means, "Dad, you need to get NordVPN." And boy was old Lung right. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while browsing the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN keep your data safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature, Threat Protection, they will block those horrific puas that lead to leprechaun-led thrashings. So, if you're like me and old Lung, and you'd rather beat up a leprechaun than have a leprechaun beat you up, then you need to sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, NordVPN is celebrating their birthday, and so as a result, they are offering you all a special deal. You can get a 2-year plan at a massive discount, plus at least 4 months or up to 1 year of service for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. That night, around 8:45 p.m., when Ruthie was back home at her apartment, she called 911. And when the dispatcher answered her call, Ruthie was in a total panic, and she was talking about something to do with the cabinets and with her bathroom and how her neighbors wanted to use her bathroom. And the dispatcher just did not understand. And they tried to ask Ruthie some clarifying questions, but Ruthie just could not put together a coherent sentence. And so the dispatcher told Ruthie that they would send police over right away. And then afterwards, the dispatcher would put out to the officers in the area that, hey, Ruthie McCoy seems to be having some sort of argument with her neighbors over cabinets. I don't really know, but someone needs to go check it out. And when the officers got that call, they were not quick to respond. They knew Ruthie. They knew that this was likely nonsense. But 15 minutes after Ruthie called 911, 911 got another call from somebody else inside of Ruthie's apartment building, and they were calling to report hearing loud noises coming from inside of Ruthie's apartment. And so at this, the police did act quickly. They rushed over to the apartment building, they went to the 11th floor, they went to Ruthie's door, and they began pounding on her door because it was locked. But Ruthie didn't come to the door, and it was totally silent inside of her apartment. And so at some point, the police called back to dispatch and asked them to call Ruthie on the phone she had just used 15 minutes earlier to call 911. And so these police officers are standing right outside of Ruthie's door, and they're listening to the sound of Ruthie's phone ringing inside of her house, but Ruthie didn't answer it. And again, the apartment stayed totally quiet. And so the responding officers turned around and began walking down the hall and knocking on other people's doors and began asking them, hey, did you hear any loud sounds coming out of Ruthie's apartment? And everybody said no. And so the police eventually just kind of gave up and left, despite not seeing Ruthie, not talking to Ruthie, not seeing what's going on inside of her apartment. The next day, when one of Ruthie's friends on her floor noticed that Ruthie had not come out of her apartment all day, and when she knocked on the door, Ruthie didn't answer, this friend called the police. The police came out again, they knocked on Ruthie's door, and after a while, when she didn't answer, the police again just left. Ruthie's friend, who had called the police, was furious that the police were not taking this seriously, and so she wound up contacting maintenance of the building, and a janitor went up to the 11th floor, went to Ruthie's door, drilled through the lock, and pushed her door open. The janitor immediately yelled out for Ruthie, but there was no response, and so he stepped inside and kind of looked around, and right away he was struck by two things. One, it was a total mess inside of her apartment. There were all these religious books and pamphlets all over the ground, but as messy as the apartment looked, it also seemed weirdly empty. Like there was no TV, there was really no furniture or anywhere to sit. It was almost like this apartment had been half moved out, and then whoever was moving it out had just kind of stopped. The janitor started to get a really bad feeling about being inside of this apartment, but he mustered the courage to walk a little farther into the apartment to look into the bedroom. And when he turned the corner and looked into that bedroom, he froze, because there on the ground was Ruthie McCoy. She was lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood. She was dead. The police were called, they came out, they walked around her apartment, and they concluded that this was kind of an open and shut case. Ruthie must have opened her door for the wrong person who came inside and killed her. Remember, this apartment building saw one murder nearly every week, so this really was kind of routine. And just a couple of days later, the police would arrest a 19-year-old living in this apartment building named Edward Turner because he was found to be in possession of Ruthie's TV. Edward did not admit to doing anything, but the police assumed that, he must have tried to rob Ruthie, and in the course of this robbery, perhaps Ruthie had tried to fight back, at which point Edward had overpowered her and killed her. But the police did suspect that there was at least one other person involved in Ruthie's murder, so they did keep investigating. And then in June, so about a month and a half after Edward was arrested, the police began hearing this very disturbing rumor about the building where Ruthie had lived. At first, the police completely dismissed it because it sounded totally made up. But when it kept coming up over and over again, whenever they interviewed anybody in this building about Ruthie's murder, the police finally decided they had to at least look into it in order to confirm that it was not true. However, when the police looked into this rumor, they would discover that it was true, and it absolutely played a role in Ruthie's murder. Back on the night of April 22nd, 1987, so the night that Ruthie called 911 in a panic, saying something about her cabinets and her neighbors and her bathroom, well, what had really happened is Ruth was home around 8:45 when she heard this loud banging sound coming from her bathroom. And then before she could go over and inspect the bathroom, her bathroom door flung open, and standing in the doorway was this dark, tall figure who just suddenly took off running through her apartment, out her front door, out into the hallway. Ruthie was so startled she had no idea what to make of it. She knew that sometimes she saw things that weren't real, and so she likely struggled to figure out, did that really happen? Am I dreaming? Am I hallucinating? What's going on? And so with all these thoughts going through her head, she called 911 to get help, but she couldn't quite describe what had even happened. And so that's why she began rambling about how her neighbors wanted to use her bathroom and the cabinets were somehow involved. It was all very confusing. And so the dispatcher obviously didn't understand what was going on, but they told Ruthie, okay, I'll pass this along and the police will be out soon. And so as Ruthie is waiting for the police to show up, she wanders over to the bathroom where this dark figure has appeared, and she walks inside and she looks at where her mirror had been above her sink. The mirror that she had spent so many hours looking into, hoping for signs of a miracle, and the mirror was gone. And in its place was this big dark hole on the wall, almost like an entrance to a dark tunnel. And as Ruthie is staring at this void, she sees these two dark hands emerge from underneath that come out of the hole and grip onto her sink. And then eyes pop up and a man's head pops up, and then he uses his arms, which are clutched onto the sink, to pull himself up and out of the hole in her wall, where he plopped down on the bathroom floor and then stood up and stared at Ruthie. And then everything after that point would have happened really fast. Ruthie likely began screaming, at which point the first man, the dark figure that had run out into the hallway and prompted Ruthie to call 911, he must have heard Ruthie screaming, and so he came running back in through the front door into Ruthie's apartment with a jacket over his head, and then at some point he or the other man who had come out of the hole in the wall yelled at Ruthie to get down on the ground. Maybe she didn't comply, maybe she did, but after that, 4 gunshots rang out. All 4 shots hit Ruthie. However, these 4 shots did not kill Ruthie right away. And so Ruthie was very alive as these 2 men stole her TV, they stole her rocking chair and some other things, and Ruthie was almost certainly still alive when the police did finally show up and began knocking on her door and calling her phone, but she was bleeding to death. She couldn't move, she couldn't make a sound, but the police just abandoned her, at which point she did die. It would turn out that disturbing rumor that the police heard about this apartment building was that apparently people in this building had learned that you could pull off your mirror inside of your bathroom and literally climb into the walls. And from that point, you could basically wander all over this building and then punch other people's mirrors in their bathrooms in, and then climb through that hole and do whatever you wanted to the people inside of that apartment. And so when Ruthie began hearing those whispers when she was in her bathroom looking at the mirror hoping for a miracle, those were the sounds of thieves and killers and criminals slinking about her wall. Detectives speculated that the 2 men who killed Ruthie likely found out about her disability payments and decided to rob her. However, the 2 men that police arrested, the 19-year-old Edward Turner, who was found in possession of her TV, and this other man who was also arrested, were ultimately acquitted because there were so many people crawling through the walls all day and night inside of this building that there was no way to prove that those 2 were the ones who actually went in and killed Ruthie. To this day, no one else has ever been charged with Ruthie's murder. What happened to Ruthie became the basis for the very popular horror movie called The Candyman, starring Tony Todd. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the like button's house, toast all of their bread, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive content on Mondays, and on Thursdays, we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the MrBallen Foundation, which honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our brand new website, ballenstudios.com, to join our Discord server, to buy merch, to see what we're up to see what events are coming up. It's all on ballenstudios.com. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.